Okay, good evening. We have a small crowd.
And small upstairs too.
Um,
We'll fill it up and
Thank
make it look big.
there you go. Yeah. So tonight we are looking at the next I am statement of Jesus. I am the light of the world. I am, no pun intended, I am very excited about this class because this John chapter 9 is amazing. And there's some really, really cool things in there that I'm excited to share with you. So I'm excited to get into this and see what it shows us about Jesus. Before we get started, Alex, would you lead us in prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for allowing us to be here tonight to be able to study your word. And we just pray for those who are mentioned in today's email and their health struggles. And we know that you have the power to heal, you have the power to comfort, you have the power to always be there for everybody. Thank you so much for the wonderful things that you've given us. Please help us to have insight into what it is that you are the light of the world. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. So here is our verse. There are a couple of where he uses this phrase, and there are actually several other places where a similar phrase is used about it. But we'll look at some of those. But here in John chapter 8, verse 12, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So I showed you this a couple weeks ago. I said these are the traditional 7 I am statements of Jesus. And we talked then about how they're actually a lot more than 7. And so, but right now, last week, you guys looked at I am the bread of life. Now we're looking at the light of the world. We'll, for the rest of this class, pretty much go through these with a couple of additional lessons. So that's just where we are in terms of the order of these statements and where we are in the study. So I want to start by talking about the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths. They call it the Feast of Shelters. And there's a very specific reason for this. I think this will give us some really important context for Jesus' statement here. And so if you look at chapter 7, it's up here, but if you look at chapter 7 and verse 2, Jesus goes to Jerusalem for a feast. And in fact, at the beginning of that chapter, that's where his brothers, there's this discussion about whether he's going to go or not, and so forth. But so it's the Feast of Booths. John very specifically tells us that's the feast. And I'm convinced that there's a reason why he tells us that. He's not just saying that just randomly, but he wants us to know that. So then he mentions it again at the end of chapter 7, toward the end of it, in verses 37 and 38. He says it's the last day of the feast. So that feast would have been 7 days long, and then they would have an 8th day of celebration and a Sabbath. And so it would last for 8 days, basically. And so this is the 8th day, the great day. And we're told Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And so you might, for the next 2 minutes, be thinking, well, we are talking about light, not water, but you will see why we're talking about water here for just a minute. So I want to share with you from the Mishnah. This is massive. I have a complete set of it, and it takes up a lot of room on my bookshelf. It's a very long document, if you can call it a document. But one of the tractates in the Mishnah is called Sukkah or Sukkot, which is Hebrew for shelters or feasts or booths. It is the Jewish teaching, basically the Pharisees' teaching about the Feast of Booths. And so they very specifically talk about a lot of things about that feast. And one of the things they talk about is this. So the honor due to the last day of the festival, which of course John just told us this is the last day of the festival, right? The water offering. How was it done? A golden flask holding 3 logs in volume. I actually didn't look up how much a log is, but it's some measurement. and filled with water from Siloam. When they reached the water gate, they blew a quavering and a sustained blast on the shofar. Shofar is a ram's horn that is hollowed out, and they would use it as a trumpet. The priest went up to the ramp on the south side of the altar and turned to his left. And it continues, if this will advance. Maybe it won't advance. I don't know what's going on. Okay, there were 2 silver bowls there, and then it goes into a lot of detail about the bowls. The one on the west was for the water, the one on the east was for wine, and then they would pour water and wine into those on the altar. They would drain down in a certain way. And then it says, to the one who pours out the water offering, everybody would say, lift up your hand so that we can see the water pouring. So there's this big ceremony that is discussed in this surrounding water. What's interesting about this was a big deal, and it was something that everybody knew about. In fact, in a minute, I'll show you as it continues. It says, like, if you haven't experienced the joy of this, you haven't experienced the joy of life. And so this was a big deal to people. We even have evidence of people like taking home souvenir like mugs showing this. And so when they would travel to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, it was one of the big 3 feasts that Jews would travel to Jerusalem for. This was one of the main attractions there, okay? And so it's in this context that Jesus says, if anyone thirsts, come to me and I will give you living water, which, by the way, living water was flowing water. They even used that phrase to refer to the water coming out of the pool of Siloam. And that's why they were bringing that living water up to the temple and pouring it out on the altar. The real reason they were doing that, I'll show you in a second, was because of Zechariah 14. And Zechariah 14, it discusses that, and it also discusses the Feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles. And so because of that, that's where this tradition came from. And very likely that was happening when Jesus made that statement about being living, or about getting living water. So here's the pool of Siloam. It's a way uphill. I don't remember. Did you go down there? Do you remember how far it is from there up to? It's a climb though,
Yeah,
right? You're going up a mountain up to get to the top of the temple.
Yeah.
So they would have this big procession with the priest and all of these people following along, carrying a gold container full of water, living water from Siloam, and they'd bring it up to the temple and pour it out there, okay? And so here's a picture of a similar perspective. I think the pool of Siloam is actually off the screen here, but they would go up here and up into the temple. Okay, all right. So just a couple of Old Testament passages. Again, I know we're talking about water. We'll get there. So with joy, you will draw water from the wells of salvation. So we sing that song based on this passage, but this is what they would be saying as they were doing that procession. They would be reciting from Isaiah chapter 12 and verse 13. So draw from the streams of salvation. That would have been a Sukkot song for Jews in Jesus' day. Also, Ezekiel 47 was part of the official reading they would do in the Sukkot holiday, which talks about water flowing out of the temple, which of course is behind Jesus' words. We'll come back to Jesus' words in one more slide. But then Zechariah 14 is where all this tradition comes from, because the Feast of Booths is mentioned in that chapter. They read this during the feast. And back in verse 8, it says, on that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the east, half of them to the west, and shall continue in summers and winter. And then combine that with Ezekiel, where it says that the water is going up to the south. They kind of put all that together and have this procession from the pool of Siloam, which was south, up to the water gate, which was called the water gate because of this ceremony. So all of that's going on. So here we are in John 7, on the last day of the feast, the great day, and Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And so, again, I think all of that is behind, all of that, what was going on is behind what Jesus is saying here. Even John doesn't spell that out for us. I think the people who were there and even his readers would have known that. Okay. So the reason for all of that is because that's not the only connection to the Mishnah and that background and what's going on at the Feast of Booths. There's another connection that's very similar to that, and it is this. Chapter 8, here we are in the same context. And again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And again, he's going to repeat that in chapter 9, verse 5. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. So the Mishnah again, let's read from this. This I think will be the last time reading from the Mishnah. They said, anyone who has not seen the rejoicing of the water drawing ceremony in his life has never seen rejoicing. The priests and Levites went down to the women's courtyard, and they made a major enactment. And there were golden candle holders there, with 4 gold bowls on their tops, and 4 ladders for each candlestick. And 4 young priests with jars of oil containing 120 loaves would climb up the ladders and pour the oil into each bowl. Out of the worn out undergarments and the girdles of the priests, they made wicks, and with them they lit the candlesticks. And there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem which was not lit up from the light of the water drawing ceremony. Okay, so you see, this is a big deal. But so this was happening after when the sun would go down on that last day of the feast, and now the whole city's lit up by this impressive light. And it's in that context that Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And so let me just show you real quickly here. So here's the temple. So inside that big temple courtyard that still exists today, this does not exist today. This is what would have been there in Jesus' time. This is from the ESV Study Bible, and you see they actually drew these light holders from the Mishnah. That's where they're getting that from. And that's why we think that it would have like this in Jesus' day. Okay. So I want you to think about this for a second. I'm going to test your Old Testament knowledge here for a little bit. What did the Feast of Booths represent? What were they commemorating at the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles or Shelters?
Comfortable chairs, I think, too.
I'm just kidding. No.
Now it's so deep.
Okay, so part of the Feast of Booths, the big part, is that they were living in booths for a week.
Yeah.
Why were they doing that? What were they remembering?
Wandering, maybe?
Yeah, the wandering in the wilderness, where they were traveling from place to place, living in tents. And so every year they would do that for a week to remember the time when they were wandering in the wilderness. Now, in addition to, so Zechariah 14, verse 7, verse 8 was where it talked about water, living water, right? Now, verse 7, there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day or night, but at evening time there shall be light. So again, that's where the rabbis came up with the idea of doing this ceremony on Sukkot. But there's another connection here, and that is, this is commemorating the wandering of the wilderness. What was going on in the wandering of the wilderness? Well, a big part of it was this. The Lord went before them by day, and a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night, and a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. So who is that pillar of fire? Who is in the pillar of fire? According to that verse. The Lord. The Lord. And so it's in the context of remembering this that Jesus stands up and says, I am the light. Again, I don't think it's a coincidence that he's using the phrase, I am there, right? He's claiming to be God. He's claiming to be the Lord, who is the light, who is the pillar of fire that guides people so that they can travel by day and by night, can walk in the darkness.
And that connection would not have been likely missed upon Jews.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus is saying this with this light.
This is going on. I'm the
at
light.
this feast. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right. So that's just a little bit of background. And so, this is just where he says that. And so let's turn our attention now then to just looking at this theme of light and darkness in John's gospel. We're going to hopefully speed through this a little bit, but let's look at some of the questions here. Question number one, what promise does Jesus attach to his being the light of the world? From in verse 12.
He who does not walk, or he who walks in the light will not walk in the darkness.
Yeah. So I hope you see the connection there, right? To Exodus chapter 13, right? They followed the pillar of fire, they could walk in the darkness because they weren't in the darkness, it was light.
Yeah, I think that they go on to say, and there would be a light of life, right?
Yeah. So yeah, he says that right here. Yep. And so I'm not going to go too much into the life imagery here because that will be another lesson, right? The resurrection of life. But lots of cool connections that you could make there as well. Okay. So this is not the only place, as if you did your lesson, you know that this is not the only place that light and darkness show up in the gospel. Dan actually mentioned the fact that Jesus pays special attention to the time of day, or not Jesus, John, as he's writing this, as he tells the story of Jesus, he pays special attention to what time of day it is, whether it's dark or whether it's light. And so I want to look at a couple examples of this, or a few examples of this. Not all of them, but let's jump down to question number 9, and he kind of does this for us. He goes through these passages. So what claim is made about Jesus in John chapter 1, verses 4 and 5?
Light bearer,
Light of men.
revealing knowledge and awareness.
Okay, yeah. Anybody else?
The light and the light meets together.
So I mean, this is the very beginning of the gospel, right? So one of the very first things he talks about as he starts writing this book is the fact that Jesus is the light, and that light gives life. And in the introduction to our lesson, it talks about how that actually in the physical world, that's true, right? And so John starts with that. This theme is central to his book, that Jesus is this light, that he's shining in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome it. And then, I mean, you can go a few verses later. He doesn't mention these, but he says John came as a witness to bear witness about the light. But John was not the light. He was bearing witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, is coming in. And of course, that true light is Jesus. Yeah, that's who he's talking about here. John was bearing witness. This is John the Baptist. So it's John the author writing about John the Baptist. Don't be confused by that. But John the Baptist was bearing witness about Jesus, who is the true light. He's coming into the world. So he's talking about this. I mean, again, you see, he's coming into the world. He's the light of the world. Already that phrase is coming up back in chapter 1. So question number 10. I just got the verse here for you that he cites. So what can we learn about the contrast between light and darkness in John 3, verses 19 through 20?
Darkness is for evil, and the wicked, and the light is for good, and for
Okay. Do you want to add something? Okay. Yeah. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward and simple, right? The Gospel of John is deceptively simple, and what I mean by that is the language is it's super straightforward. Like he repeats himself a lot, like says things over and over, and it's very tempting. In fact, for a long time in my life, I read the Gospel of John, and I was like, number one, I kind of don't get a lot of it because it's so. There are things that he says that I don't understand. Number two, it seems really simple, which is contradiction, right? But that's how I saw the book. And then I started digging into it and remembering that the author of the Gospel of John is also the author of the book of Revelation. And I started noticing how rich the imagery is here. And specifically how rich the imagery is in using Old Testament references and Old Testament imagery. Okay, we're gonna talk some more about that as we get into chapter 9 in particular.
You know what's kind of cool, just thinking about the contrast is the effect that light has on darkness. Darkness can't have that same effect on lightness.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's just kind of cool, like
yeah.
we can have all this light, and unless you take away the source, you know, darkness can't come in. So I don't know, think that's kind of cool that he is the light which darkness cannot extinguish.
Yeah, I think so I'll jump ahead a little bit. So we're gonna talk about creation here in a minute. And I mean, that's where he starts the lesson. We're gonna dig it into it a little bit deeper than he does. But I think when God created the world, he created it in a way to reveal himself, to reveal deeper truths about himself, right? And I don't think it's coincidence. I think God knew what he was doing. He created light and darkness like that, and then used that as an image.
If you really think about it, light cannot exist.
All right, so let's move to a question. Oh yeah, one more thing about this real quick is think about what was happening when Jesus spoke those words about light and darkness. Who is he talking to in John chapter 3? Anybody remember? It doesn't say up there.
Nicodemus.
Nicodemus. And when did Nicodemus come and talk to him? At night. And so Jesus has some things to say to him about light and darkness, and comparing them to wickedness and goodness, right? Because he's specifically coming to him at night because he's afraid and wants the cover of darkness. And so Jesus has some things to say about the value of light. Okay, so chapter 11, this isn't one of the questions, but another important reference to this. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the light, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Question 11, what promise does Jesus make in chapter 12, verses 35 and 36? Right at the very end of that. Sorry,
Basically tells you that when people leave, you will have light, like, Yeah.
So I think that's going to be really important too for John chapter 9. And it's gonna do that, okay?
Well, you're essentially, he's already saying that he's light. So you become a son of light.
Yeah, so so there's a different, like, even in some self-help book or something that they read that talked about how it's powerful to just say, like, I am somebody who does this instead of saying I do this, right? It motivates you in interesting ways. And so he's saying you won't just walk in the light, but you will become light. You will become like him. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a second. All right. This is just what I had up here before. And then this is what Dan pointed out that so in chapters 1 through 12, it mentions light a lot of times. Then in chapters 13 through 19, it stops mentioning it so many times, but there's something really important happening, and that is those events are happening in the darkness. When Judas betrays him, it's dark. When he's arrested, it's dark. When he's on trial, it's dark. Like all of this stuff. Even when he's in the tomb, it's dark. And obviously, there was a day went past when he was crucified and stuff. John doesn't mention that because he's focusing on how all of these events are in the darkness. And so Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb while it's still dark. And of course, then after that, okay, so before we jump into chapter 9, I know we're doing a lot of background before we get into the passage, but hopefully it will pay off when we get there. Let's talk about creation imagery in John. This is something that is really cool once you start to see it. Can you think of any references to creation in the Gospel of John?
in the beginning.
Okay, yeah, chapter 1, verse 1, right? So it starts in exactly the same way as Genesis does, right? In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Anything else?
Well, I mean, it's a manifestation of John 3:16.
Okay.
God loved the world, and so he knew this plan of redemption. And sooner or later, he would appear the Son.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. It's part of God's plan from the beginning, not one that I thought of. But yeah, good. So here's one. So verse 2, somebody just mentioned verse 1, right? Verse 2 of chapter 1, Jesus was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made, right? Verses 4 and 5 immediately talk about, we had this up just a minute ago. Verses 4 and 5 immediately talk about what? It's our theme.
In the light.
Yeah, light and darkness, right? What's the very first thing God says in Genesis 1? Let there be light. Yeah, it's the very first thing. And it's also the very first thing in John 1. Okay. So John's gospel is starting with all kinds of creation. It continues then with a bunch more. This is what I just mentioned, verse 5. It's similar to Genesis chapter 1. So light and darkness, life obviously is important for Genesis 1 through 3, the creation narrative. Work, God puts Adam in the garden to work it, keep it, and Jesus is going to talk about that specifically in the context of Sabbath. God rested and worked for 7 days and then rested on the seventh. In John chapter 5, he makes that connection. It's going to come up in chapter 9 also. Water, the Spirit was hovering over the face of the waters, right? In darkness, by the way, before God created light. Spirit is an important theme, obviously, in John, if you know John, and of course, the Spirit was an important part of creation. So here's another example. So John's gospel starts with creation imagery. It ends with creation imagery. John's gospel is the only one that tells us that when Jesus went to pray before the night that he died, it was in a garden. He's the only one that tells us that Jesus' tomb was in a garden. Then I just love this. John 20, verse 15, Mary Magdalene is looking for the body. She's weeping and supposing Jesus to be the gardener. She said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him." And of course, then she realizes he's Jesus, which, of course, in light of all this other imagery, sounds an awful lot like God walking in the garden. Maybe by itself it wouldn't, but again, in light of all the other connections, I think it does. And so this is a connection that I think there are lots of interesting connections between this and what we're going to look at now in John chapter 9. Genesis 3, verse 5. This is something that Satan says. He says, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened." Right? Recognize the connection to John 9 right there. "You will be like God, and you will know good and evil." Those are the promises that Satan made. And of course, there's a ton of irony in that, right? Because when Satan speaks, he's lying. But also, all three of these things are things that Adam and Eve already had before Satan promised them, right? Like their eyes literally were opened already, right? They were like God. He created them in his image, right? And they knew good and evil. In chapter 2, God tells Adam to take care of the trees, which God saw and knew that they were good, right? And they knew it was evil. God told them, "Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." But then Satan comes along and says, "Well, don't listen to what don't look at what God's already given you. You should look for something." Okay? So we need to just keep that in mind. And also keep in mind this connection in chapter 8, which is right before chapter 9 starts, where Jesus says that the Jews are of their father, the devil. Okay? So with that said, my PowerPoint slides pretty much end here because I ran out of time. I didn't know I was teaching tonight until last night, so it's just my bad. But I want to look with you at chapter 9, okay? So let's start in verse 1. And question number 2, what does Jesus see in chapter 9 of verse 1? Yeah. So he walks by and he sees a blind man. Okay, John is using language very deliberately here, right?
Jesus noticed him.
Yeah.
It wasn't the other way around. It was Jesus came to him as a call.
Yeah.
To be blind.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, well, she always is.
Yeah, so I want to just underscore here as we go through that I want to underscore some of these connections back to creation, okay, in this narrative. So in Genesis chapter 1, over and over and over and over again, God looks at his creation and he saw that it was good. And that's where John starts in this chapter. Jesus saw his creation, right? And interestingly, the guy that he sees is going to turn out to be pretty good. Okay, so question number 3, why was this man born blind?
The works of God.
Yeah. So I mean, this question comes off of like, who said this man or his parents? We actually know the answer to that, right? Like the reason there's suffering and pain in this world goes back to Genesis 3. Creation. Not the initial creation, but the downfall of creation in those opening chapters.
This also displays the divine nature of Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. How so?
Well, Jesus is the one that cured his blindness.
Yeah.
So you know, that doesn't just happen.
Yep.
And not only that, and you may get to it, not only that, but he does it with dirt.
Yep.
Yep. And it would seem that the dirt would have something to do with God's creation again, of just something natural from the dirt is all it took to do it.
Yeah. Good.
And
Good.
Jesus' divine nature.
Yep. So I was going to get to that. So thank you
Okay.
for going there. Yeah, absolutely.
The other,
I was just saying, I mean, it's important that he's from birth. Like, that's an important identifier too. It's not someone that they've known has been blind but could see as well, and to be able to say like, oh, maybe he was just faking it the whole time or whatever. Like, this is a known man who's been blind his entire life, so he has nothing to compare the experiences to.
So to kind of tie this together, great point.
Sorry.
It shows that I mean, this is a real miracle, right? This isn't just, he wasn't just pretending to be blind for a little while. I think it's verse 23. I don't have it up here. You guys can look. It says, never since the creation of the world has a man born blind been healed, something like that, right? So interestingly, it specifically mentions creation again, to make my point, which is a secondary point maybe, but I think some of these connections are gonna make some cool applications. Okay.
yeah, the thing that I liked about that particular thing, and this is sidebar, is the blind man did not ask to be healed.
Yeah.
Jesus just did it. There was no stipulation where
Interesting.
other times he would say,
Yeah, they're really
don't tell anybody, or he would say, go and sin no more. There's all that other stuff. This guy, I just think that's.
Just have to be there when they're asking them some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Jesus knows everything, right? He knows this guy's heart. He knows what's gonna happen. And so Jesus is like, I'm glad you asked these questions. Let me show you. So that brings us then to question 4. And this one's important for kind of tying together where we've been going in this class. What connection does Jesus make between healing this blind man and his claim to being blind in the world? So verses 4 and 5.
Well, he brings spiritual light to the blind.
So I think what I want you to notice is Jesus has just made this claim in chapter 8 that he is the light of the world, the glowing fire and everything. This is where they are, right? And he's just made this claim. And so now, as they're walking out of the temple and they see this guy, Jesus says, I'm going to prove to you all these things against me. And so I didn't mention, but let me just point out the fact that Jesus says at the beginning of chapter 8, he is the light of the world. And then chapter 8 is the chapter, it's the I am chapter in the book, okay? Like that is the chapter where he says, I am multiple times, just going back and forth with the Pharisees. And then by the end of the chapter, he says, before Abraham was, I am. Like he has to keep saying it for them to get it. And then finally he says it and they get it and they're trying to kill him. And he's headed out, and then he says, you know what? I'm not just going to say that I'm the light of the world. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. Exactly what it looks like to make it so that people who are in darkness can walk.
And God also told Moses when when he goes to talk to the Jews, it's who should I say sent me? He says, I am, right?
Yeah.
So
He's also predicting. It's like foreshadowing stuff too. I mean, he does it a lot as well, but I kind of see it as this work the works of him who sent me while this day and night is coming and no one can work. Like I have to do this while I can. There's gonna be a time where I was gone, and as long as you're with me, you're in the light, you can do the works. If you're not, you're in darkness and the works aren't available anymore for you.
So I'm gonna ask you in a few minutes to think about this. I guess I am now, but to think about this from the perspective of John's original readers, who of course were living after the fact. This is probably one of the latest books in the Old Testament or in the New Testament written. So Jesus was already gone by the time he's writing, right? So when Jesus says that, they know that, just like us. But then there's a point that he's making for those readers. And so we're going to come to what is that point? What's he trying to say for people who are now living in a time when Jesus isn't here?
First of all, the other thing that happened in 8, you obviously have the woman that was brought before Jesus, an adultery. But after all that went by, in verse 12, he says, again, he spoke to them again, I am the light of the world, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. But then again, the verse he said, you are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Like, well, anybody can say that. Yeah. But what he did then in chapter 9 is exactly addressing the very thing that they were questioning back in the
I think, let's see, is this the next question that we have up here? No, it's not, but let's come to this real quick. Well, yeah, when we get to question 8, let's come back to that, okay? Because yes, their response is so important, and he's proving it. But I want you to know, like, are they going to get it? Even after it doesn't hurt. That's going to be the interesting thing to see. So, question 5: what process does Jesus use to heal them? You already mentioned this, but yeah. So first he speaks to him, right? Then he spits, makes the clay with his spit, rubs it on his eyes, and then he tells him to do what? Yeah, go wash in the pool that's called Scent. And that's what that word means. So he goes through that process, and I do think there are reasons. There's actually like Dead Sea Scrolls stuff that talk about spit and creation, all kinds of interesting connections there that we don't know. Okay, so question number 8. Notice how the people respond to this. All right, so if you just go through the rest of the chapter, one of the questions, I went out of order. One of the questions is, how does the man respond to it? We'll come to that in a second. But first of all, he goes to the neighbors, right? And the neighbors are questioning, who is he with? Like, what happened? Then the Pharisees or the Jews, the Jewish leaders, try to see if he can be used as a good witness against Jesus. It's kind of an interesting response to a miracle. And then it kind of comes to a head there where they cast him out of the synagogue, right? And then finally the guy's going to go and meet up with Jesus again.
They even bring in his parents.
Yeah, his parents. That's what I was leaving out. And so think about all those responses. Like, this is how people respond to Jesus, even now, right? The man just was like, I've been healed. I'm gonna obey Jesus. Like, of course I am going to. Sometimes people do that with Jesus. The neighbors are like, well, we don't know what's going on. Like, we don't really care. The parents are like, we'll just, or maybe I had that backwards. The neighbors are like, we're going to defer to the religious authorities, right? The parents are like, we don't know what's going on. We're gonna just claim ignorance. And then the religious leaders are like, we're going to oppose him and reject him, like, no matter what. What's interesting about that is all of those people, all of them, except for one, seem to be just completely blind to the fact that a miracle just took place, right? Like, this is a miracle. He's been blind his entire life since birth. And all of these people, no matter how they respond, except for the one, are just, they completely ignore that fact.
And one of the reasons it's stated is they were feared, the religious leaders of being put out of the synagogue.
I think it's a lot like, though, and this is why I put that verse up from Genesis 3, where Satan was saying, you know, your eyes will be open if you obey me rather than God. You know, you'll be like God if you obey me rather than God. It's so easy for us to know what God has given us, blessed us with, but then be deceived by Satan that we need to focus on other things, that we need something else. And then just be completely blind to the fact that God has already given us what we need. Eve was blind to the fact that God had already given her all those things that Satan promised her. And these people, the religious leaders, the neighbors, the parents, all of them are just blind to the fact that Jesus has just healed this man. And Jesus is the answer to all their problems. All of the problems, right? Religious leaders, problem, all of them. We're out of time already. Okay. Yeah, let me just leave you with this. Another thing from that Genesis 3 passage is Satan says you'll become like God. We're already created in the image of God. Notice as you go back to this chapter, notice how this guy not only grows in his faith in God, which is what the question that we've got about that asks, he actually becomes like Jesus. And there's one important way that I want to, so when he anoints his eyes, Jesus uses the phrase anoints, which is the word Christ. Like, he doesn't have to use that word, but he anoints him like Jesus is anointed. There are a bunch of things like that in this chapter where strange plays on words are used to portray this guy like Jesus. But the one that's most relevant for this study is when the neighbors are trying to figure out who the guy is, what happened? They say, "Are you that guy?" And his response is, "Anybody remember?" Okay, so in the original, you know what it says? It doesn't say "I am the man." Let's clarify. The translators are helping us. In the original, he says "I am." And then the neighbors say, "Well, some people say he is." That's actually the phrase for Yahweh. Others say no, he's like him, like Jesus. But then the man says, "No, I am." And so I don't think the point there is that he's claiming to be God, right? He's not claiming to be God. This is the only place in John's gospel where somebody besides Jesus says, "I am." And a lot of commentaries say, "Oh, it's just a coincidence. Somebody can think of it." He's becoming like God. He's becoming like Jesus because, unlike all the other people who are just blind to what Jesus is doing, he just listens and trusts him. And he starts doing the things Jesus tells him to do, starting with washing. And the more he does that, the more he becomes like Jesus. So I think the point, and with this, I promise, the point for John's readers is that the same readers who First and Second, Third John were written to, right? First John in particular, they were facing persecution, just like this guy was facing persecution. People were telling them to reject Jesus. And the point of John's gospel is just obey him in the little things. And as you keep doing that, you will become more like him, and you will be like this guy. It's just, that's what it's about. That's what we can learn from this place. Thank you, guys.